Hey, everybody, welcome back to Lettermen Row. I am Austin Ward, joined as always by my colleagues Jeremy Birmingham and Spencer Holbrook. It's our continuing series looking at the Ohio State Buckeyes staying or going with the NFL draft and what that means for the program as they head into 2021 and look to defend that Big Ten crown and get back to the college football playoff. They will do it without one of the best offensive linemen that any of us have ever seen. Wyatt Davis declared again for the NFL draft. So not a surprise that this move happened. Everyone was expecting it when he opted out in September, came back in, went through the senior day festivities. He was not going to take advantage of that last year available to him or the COVID bonus year or any of that. You don't need to when you're an all-decade offensive guard, an All-American, an absolute mauler, and a great personality off the field as well. Wyatt Davis earned the opportunity to move on. Nobody here is going to blame him for that.
I'm going to blame him. How dare you? How dare you, sir? No, I mean, obviously, Wyatt is a kind of a fan favorite. He's one of our favorites on the media side. He sort of was that next iteration of offensive lineman that, we've been fortunate enough to cover in the last decade. There's always one or two of the offensive linemen that are just genuinely great people to talk to on the record, off the record. And then they also happen to be all American type football players. And, for Wyatt, when he committed to Ohio State back in 2016, it was a huge win for the Buckeyes. And you just love to see that kind of development because he was obviously the number one ranked guard in the country coming out of high school, and to leave as the number one guard in the college football, he did what he needed to do and the Buckeyes did what they needed to do.
Yeah, that's really saying something, Vern, to go wire to wire when you have those expectations and then to fulfill them. That's another matter entirely. That's really not easy to do. You're constantly trying to prove yourself, validate that lofty rating to stay number one all the way through. There's really something to be said for the way he handles his business. And that will also, play in here. Spencer, as part of his legacy, he's been in that room and he's worked with some guys, shown them how to play with toughness, how to play through injuries, how to prepare for games. Before we talk about who might fill those shoes, that might be the most important part of the legacy that he leaves behind, is setting that example over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and you could tell throughout the season he had some issues, whether it was his knee or, it seemed like every game he had some sort of injury happen to him, and he just kept fighting through it. He fought for a season. He came back to play. He wasn't going to be denied the opportunity to play in every game. My only issue is that we didn't get to see him in a full 13, 14, or 15 game schedule because I wanted to hear how many knockdowns he would have accrued compared to Jonah Jackson from last year. But he's been the rock. He's been very steady in this offensive line. You can always count on, no matter what, he was going to create a hole. There was no really doubt that whether you needed a yard or 2 yards, you should run behind number 52 because he was going to get you there. So I think replacing that is probably the hardest thing. And then that vocal leadership that he had, you don't find that every day in the number one guard in the country. Sometimes you just don't know what you're going to get with an offensive lineman. They're either very outgoing or very, inward. And I think he was as outgoing as you could be. And I think that helped him in the leadership aspect of the game.
So when we take this absence and replacing Wyatt Davis, it's probably tempting and smart to lump it in with Josh Myers, just two of the best offensive linemen in the country, a center and guard. We've already talked about Josh Myers and who those options might be to play at center. But, really, Ohio State is expecting now to have both of those tackles back with Thayer Munford using that extra year. Nicholas Petit-Frere didn't post any NFL draft declaration on Monday night. So clearly he didn't feel the need and is just going to be returning. But then you're going to have some movement. So Harry Miller, who started most of the season at guard, the likely move for him would be down to center. That's always been the plan. So that would mean that all three of those spots in the interior, even if you have an experienced player like Miller, relatively experienced player, all three of those spots are going to be new people. So looking at the interior line as a whole, that's kind of a big offseason task for Greg Studrawa.
It is, and you're kind of just fortunate that this season went the way it did because you were forced to play so many offensive linemen over the last month and a half of the season for Ohio State that you probably wouldn't have in a normal year. You would have played those guys in September, and then as the season went along, they wouldn't have got the opportunity to get the real run against the Big Ten champs, the Big Ten championship game, Clemson, Alabama. So you saw Matt Jones really step up and play well. You saw Paris Johnson come in against Clemson and Alabama and have to play when Wyatt went down, and when Harry Miller was out with the COVID protocols. So, and then you have guys like Luke Whippler, who I think are a really talented player that's going to be hard to keep off the field. Enoch Vamahi, who still questions about what he's going to do if he's going to be moving to defensive line, because that's where he warmed up against Alabama for some reason. There's a lot of movement, a lot of flexibility. The Buckeyes did have 6 offensive linemen in the class of 2020, and only Paris Johnson really played from that group. So there's a whole bevy of them waiting, including guys like Ryan Jacoby from 2019 class that are waiting for their opportunity. And hell, I mean, the guy that I think that we all sort of wrote off at the beginning of the year was Max Ray on the offensive line, and he stepped in and allowed the Buckeyes to start working Paris Johnson at guard. So there's this opportunity. The Buckeyes have made it a point to recruit versatile offensive linemen, guys that can play all 5 spots. I love Josh Fryer, for example, who is a guy a lot of the, casual fans may not know about, but I think he's a player that is going to compete for in the 2 deep as well. So there's no shortage at the offensive line. When Ryan Day took over in 2019, that was the major question mark on the roster, and it was quickly addressed. And now you have really a ton of really good young talent that's waiting to play.
Yeah, that's a fascinating sort of mix that they have there, because you have multiple guys who could all play center there with Miller, Matthew Jones, or Whippler. Paris Johnson. If somebody were to go down at left or right tackle, you have to assume that he would kick right out there. He's just too good to be on the sideline. So if it has to be at guard, you can understand why Ohio State would start him there with the intention that he could play multiple spots. The same, maybe to a lesser extent, is true with DeJuan Jones with right. His versatility. I think it's hard sometimes to imagine somebody with his size just operating at guard, and how mountainous and difficult that might be for the next quarterback to see over those guys in front of him. But that tells you, again, to your point, Berm, about the versatility, what Ohio State could do. Those are talented athletic tackles, but you don't want to just leave them on the sideline. And that's not a position where you like to rotate, because chemistry is so important. You're not going to sub in and out on a drive. So you're trying to pick the best 5. That seems a little easier for them to do attack. But then what do you do with that talent? And how does it work out? Like March and April aren't going to really tell that tale. This thing will go, I think, all the way into August.
I think it's the best problem to have that both the tackles decided to come back, because now you've got to shuffle guys in and out, figure out where these guys go. And I think the constant in this room is, like Berm said, there's no shortage of talent. It went from a room that Urban Meyer used to categorize as dangerously thin to now one of the strongest units on the field. And no matter who you put in there, it seems like there's at least 2 or 3 guys you could plug in at any spot on this offensive line and feel really confident, rolling into a game and racking up 200 or 300 rushing yards. And I think that is just an incredible feat for this offensive line. I do think the versatility that Paris Johnson was able to show, Matthew Jones having some experience, guard, center, whatever he could do. Berm talked about Josh Fryer. I'm looking at Luke Whippler. I think he could have a huge impact in this offensive line room. I just think he's too smart, too cerebral, and too talented to keep off the field. I think it's going to be hard to keep him off the field, but it's also going to be hard to find a spot for him on the field. And I think they have their hands full this offseason, but it's a really good problem to have.
It's kind of funny how this works, because we all get it's human nature to pay attention to the new guys, the shiny toys that arrive, and touted freshmen and all that. And that used to be Matthew Jones. I mean, he was a 4-star, maybe not as highly recruited as Whippler or Harry Miller, but certainly up there, and was expected to be projected, I believe, Berm, as the number 1 center in the country at that point. I think maybe it was 3 or 4 years in a row where Ohio State signed the top-ranked center according to those rankings. Playing offensive line is much harder than Wyatt Davis might make it look. And normally you need some time. So Matthew Jones goes into junior year in the program, hadn't really had that opportunity. You kind of forget about him. You're thinking, well, who else could fill that void? I mean, he stepped up in a major way in 2 games. Those Michigan State, and then going out there on relatively short notice in the Sugar Bowl, and grading as a champion in both of those games at guard. Those were incredibly important performances, and they can also be springboards for him heading into spring camp.
Yeah, I mean, it's with apologies to the tailbacks who have already disparaged in our previous video. The offensive line is the hardest position to prepare for and to adjust to, and as you go into college and beyond. And it takes years. It's not a position where players should play as a freshman, or in most cases at a place like Ohio State, where you don't want them to play as freshmen or sophomores. You want them to have time to learn all of the different protections to get their bodies physically ready, because you're dealing with, you're playing against the biggest of the big. And so it should take 2 or 3 years to get a guy ready. And you even see it in like Nick Petit-Frere, who is, in my opinion, the best right tackle in the Big Ten this last year. He's a guy, I'm sorry, left tackle in the Big Ten. He's a guy that just whatever tackle. What position did he play? Right,
he
left,
played right
everyone.
tackle, Burham. Yeah,
right tackle. Yeah, my brain is.
Their Munford is on the left side. They also call that the blind side.
Okay, so here's the deal. See, we're on Zoom, right? So everything is backwards for me. So this is my right.
You're looking at it from the defensive perspective. Right. I got you.
Right, and so those are two of the best tackles in the Big Ten, and it took Nick Petit-Frere 3 years to become good, and he was the #1 ranked offensive tackle coming out of high school. Yeah. So it takes time, and you just hope that as a coaching staff, these players with the free transfer rule coming and all that stuff, that they trust in it enough to let that time come and develop.
And I think that that's something that applies here to Harry Miller in a different way. He got on the field, probably before he was fully ready, because Ohio State needed him to play guard. He played well. I don't think he had some holding penalties that we all know about in the game when he had to play center when Josh Myers was out. It wasn't perfect, but you're going to go through some growing pains, and we've seen that before with Ohio State guys who didn't have 2 or 3 years to develop the way that a Nicholas Petit-Frere might have. Just ask Billy Price. Burham, I know you have multiple times about the feedback he received early in his career, or Pat Elflein. Like, you're not ready to play, big boy football on the offensive line just with the 12 or 13 or 14 months. And Harry Miller didn't get that spring and didn't get all those reps. Like, this is still a guy who is a 5-star for a reason, and extremely intelligent, and he will grow from that experience if he handles it the right way, which I assume that we will. It's not easy. Nobody likes to be criticized, and you certainly don't want to make sweeping assessments of a sophomore when you can still get better, just like Billy Price or Pat Elflein or any of these other guys did by the end of their careers.
I think Harry Miller has a chance to become, among that category if he puts in the work and takes the criticism the right way, because Billy Price and Pat Elflein obviously took the criticism, ran with it, and made themselves into Remington Trophy winners. I think Harry Miller has that in him if he takes it the right way. Everything we've seen from him shows that he can take it the right way, and I think he will, and I think he's going to grow from it and become one of the best centers in the country if he wins the center job. And if not, he could be the best guard in the country. It's a kind of interchangeable with him because he's so versatile on the interior there.
The reason that Harry played as much as he did this past year, despite obviously having some challenges, I mean, the Michigan State game, that I'm not going to put that on him at all. I mean, you get told midweek you're going to play center, all of a sudden things get a little spooky. He's playing because the coaches trust him and because of his intelligence and his ability to process and to make adjustments on the fly. You aren't going to be perfect. And in a group where you have 4 of the best offensive linemen in the country, in Petit-Frere and Thayer Munford and Josh Myers and Wyatt Davis, it's sort of like someone has to be the worst of that group, right? And it's not necessarily
like boy band.
Right. Somebody has to be not.
Somebody has to be Joey Fatone.
Right. Somebody has to be Joey Fatone, and that doesn't mean that he has to be Joey Fatone forever. Okay, it just means that when you're being a comparison is the thief of joy, I guess is what I'm trying to say here. Okay, Harry Miller would have been a starter at any other program in the Big Ten all year long and would have been their best offensive lineman, and that's just the fact. So maybe it stood out a little bit for this offensive line because everyone else was playing at a really, really high level, and he's the guy that's just learning how to play college football. So I guess I would implore people to take a deep breath and let a guy get a full year of development and in a normal season and see where things go, because he's a really good player.
Let's hope it gets back to normal. There's going to be a fascinating, interesting, competitive year coming for Ohio State on the interior of the offensive line with Wyatt Davis officially and staying in the NFL draft this time. And Josh Meyer is gone as well at center, breaking it down with Birmingham and Spencer Holbrook, all the comings and goings for the Ohio State roster in a busy key offseason for the Big Ten champions. For those two guys, I'm Austin Ward. We'll see you next time with full coverage of the Ohio State Buckeyes at LettermenRow.com.